ability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the June 16th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: oil prices fell, bonds rallied, and the Dow Industrials closed at a record 51671.03 after Trump announced a deal to end the war with Iran and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The Justice Department senior leadership closed an investigation of Paramount Skydance's bid for Warner Brothers Discovery before career staffers who were concerned about the acquisition had an opportunity to object. Foxcorp is acquiring Roku in a deal valued at around $25 billion, making a major bet on the future of ad-supported streaming. Renault and Thales made a prototype of a tactical vehicle for military land forces as automakers and defense suppliers gear up to play a larger role in arms production. General Motors is in talks with Lockheed Martin about making parts for the defense contractor's weapons. A consumer demanded that Anthropic reimburse customers of its most expensive AI subscription plans, alleging in a lawsuit that the company oversold the usage allowances it offered. Talks between Anthropic and the Trump administration continued without a deal to resolve the security concerns that pushed the White House to restrict access to the AI company's latest model. A federal judge in California dismissed a lawsuit from Elon Musk's xAI that accused OpenAI of trying to steal trade secrets. France-based Schneider Electric said it would work with Taiwan's Foxconn to develop AI data centers. Now for the highlights under the worldwide section. Trump said the Strait of Hormuz would be fully open on Friday, the day the U.S. and Iran plan to conclude a peace deal in Switzerland that ends a 4-month war and kick-starts nuclear negotiations. The agreement raised alarm in Israel, where officials are wrestling with the consequences of easing the pressure on Tehran and the risks of opening a rift with the U.S. California Governor Gavin Newsom said the Justice Department is investigating him and his wife, accusing Trump of pushing the probe to punish a political enemy. Russian airstrikes killed at least 11 people in Ukraine and damaged cultural sites across the country, including one of the holiest sites in Eastern Orthodoxy. 8 crew members were believed dead after a B-52 bomber crashed shortly after takeoff at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The UK plans to force leading social media companies to restrict access to their sites for children under 16. Authorities reported one of the highest daily increases in Ebola cases in a month-long outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Democrats in Congress sent letters to the National Science Foundation asking it to reverse its plan to dismantle an ocean monitoring network. The eldest son of Norway's Crown Prince, Mette Marit, was sentenced to 4 years in prison after being convicted of rape. The picture on today's front page shows President Trump and President Macron of France in a very awkward handshake. And that caption reads, "Arm's length." French President Emmanuel Macron greets President Trump on Monday in Evian-Bas as the G7 summit opens. Europe's leaders are in a less trusting mood with the U.S. In that headline, Trump starts visit to a wary Europe. The article, Europe is aiming to avoid fighting president at G7. Before leaving for the talks, Trump stepped up tensions with the host, by Stacey Maitri, Natalie Andrews, and Noemi Bisserby. Europeans once thought they could win favor with President Trump by lavishing praise on him and pandering to his foreign policy objectives. Those days are long gone. As European leaders gather with Trump in person this week for the first time since the start of the Iran war, their goal will be simple: avoid a repeat of the cage match that took place on the White House lawn over the weekend. Trump's blow-ups with allies over Iran and Greenland have scarred European leaders so badly that many wonder whether they can still reason with him. They are also under pressure with voters at home who increasingly question whether the U.S. is still a reliable ally. Those wounds were still fresh as allies converged on the French lakeside town of Evian-Bas on Monday for a 3-day meeting of the group of 7 leading nations. Allies welcomed the interim peace deal between the U.S. and Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which European officials hope will calm tensions heading into the summit. Still, the text of the deal hasn't been released or signed, leaving allies with questions about its implementation. One question is whether the deal provides enough assurances for allies to help reopen the strait. Trump has rallied against European allies over their refusal to escort ships during the war. Trump administration officials now expect allies to help the U.S. remove mines from the strait and restore the flow of oil shipments from Gulf countries. France, Germany, Italy, and the UK on Monday said they were committed to moving forward with an international mission to clear mines and escort commercial shipments, but added that the mission must remain strictly defensive and independent. France's Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier battle group has been deployed to the region as part of the French-UK-led mission, but French officials say they don't want belligerent parties, including the U.S., involved in its operations. French officials also want a clear pledge from Iran that the mission won't come under attack. The resources are in place and ready to be deployed, French President Emmanuel Macron said, calling for the swift and full implementation of the deal. While the conflict with Iran is expected to dominate the discussions, the G7 will cover a range of issues from international trade and the war in Ukraine to the rise of artificial intelligence that create a diplomatic minefield for allies. Before leaving for the G7, Trump ratcheted up tensions with its host Macron, telling the New York Post the U.S. will have no choice but to impose a 100% tariff on French wines if France maintains its digital tax on tech giants. It doesn't work like that, Macron responded after arriving in Evian-Bas. The digital tax is part of our legal system. It's not up to the United States to decide. Macron, who was scheduled to give Trump a red carpet welcome, was a no-show as Trump arrived at the summit. Leaders face a balancing act in taking a more assertive approach to Trump that won't deepen the rift in transatlantic relations. Trump has publicly mused about withdrawing from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization over European leaders' decision to sit out the war in the Middle East. And Europeans continue to rely on vital intelligence sharing with the U.S. in their efforts to support Ukraine in fending off Russia. Other articles from the front page follow. Oil prices fall, stocks climb on Iran deal. U.S. indexes cap best three-session stretch in more than a year. NASDAQ rises 3.1%. By Heather Gillers. Investors just shook loose one of the biggest drags on market sentiment since late February. Oil prices fell, bonds rallied, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed at a record on Monday after President Trump announced a deal to end the war with Iran and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most vital artery for energy shipments. The latest Middle East developments added to the ledger of optimistic news and capped the market's best three-session stretch since the May 2025 tariff de-escalation with China. Wednesday's readout on lower inflation, followed by Friday's blockbuster stock debut by Elon Musk's SpaceX, had left investors feeling good about stocks heading into the weekend. It's like a three-legged stool supporting the market today, said Shannon Saccocia, Chief Investment Officer of Wealth at Neuberger Berman. Chip stocks soared, with the PHLX Semiconductor Index gaining 5.5%. Europe finally clawed back its wartime stock losses, with the pan-continental stock Europe 600 closing at a record. Shares of United Airlines rose 3.9% to close at a record. Higher oil prices had put pressure on airlines, helping push Spirit Airlines into bankruptcy. The Dow Industrials gained 0.9% to close at a record for the 16th time this year. The NASDAQ Composite rose 3.1%, and the S&P 500 added 1.7%. The market is interpreting this as the economy is going to get stronger, said Joseph Brasuelis, chief economist at RSM. Several thorny issues still need to be ironed out to bring a clear end to the conflict. While Trump said the strait would be fully open on Friday, the same day the U.S. and Iran planned to complete a peace deal in Switzerland, Senior U.S. officials said it could take more than 2 weeks to resume normal shipping operations in the strategic waterway. Trump, a Republican, is expected to ask allies for help in demining the strategic waterway. He also will have to convince counterparts that he can ultimately compel Iran to dispose of its enriched material without a return to war, Israel to stand idly by, and commercial shipping companies to resume normal operations in the Strait. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Warsh wants the Fed to stop talking so much, by Nick Timiraeus. Kevin Warsh boiled down his advice for the Federal Reserve before an audience of investors last year. Stop talking so much, he said. More thinking, less talking. For more than a decade, Warsh has argued that the Fed should say less. How much a central bank reveals about its thinking shapes mortgage rates, markets, and the cost of borrowing for everyone. Wall Street will parse Wednesday's meeting, his first as Fed chairman, for any sign of where he'll take it. As a Fed governor through the 2008-9 crisis, Warsh had a front row seat watching Ben Bernanke pioneer two of the central bank's biggest innovations this century, a far larger holding of bonds and a more systematic practice of explaining its moves. Bernanke was extending a shift Alan Greenspan began in the 1990s when the Fed first started announcing its rate decisions and signaling where they might head. Warsh quit in 2011 after souring on the bond buying and has spent the years since arguing the Fed took both innovations too far. Now that he's in charge, the question is whether he proceeds as a revolutionary, a diplomat, or both. Whatever Warsh hoped to do on interest rates will have to wait. Inflation is running hot after the war in Iran sent up energy prices. The conversation at the Fed has shifted toward hikes, not cuts. It would be a near impossible setup for a new chairman to override, even if he wished to. That leaves two ambitious projects which are moving at different speeds. Shrinking the bond holdings could take years, and communications is where he can move first. Being fenced in on rates with no fight to wage there frees him to spend his energy on it. DOJ cleared Paramount deal as staffers looked to fight it. By Dave Michaels, Dana Mattioli, Sadie Gurman, and Jessica Tunkill. Washington. The Justice Department senior leadership closed an investigation of Paramount Skydance's bid for Warner Brothers Discovery before career staffers who were concerned about the acquisition had an opportunity to object, according to people familiar with the matter. A team of career lawyers who had spent months scrutinizing the deal were leaning toward recommending a lawsuit challenging it on the grounds that the combination of the owners of two movie studios would be anti-competitive and violate antitrust law, the people said. The staff investigators hadn't yet made a final recommendation, a typical step in the deal review process, and were told Friday that the department would close the investigation effectively clearing the deal at the federal level, some of the people said. The Justice Department's senior leaders believed that Paramount Chief Executive Officer David Ellison, son of Trump ally Larry Ellison, persuasively addressed many of the staff's questions about the deal during a 2-hour interview last month, according to people familiar with their thinking. Remote work appears here to stay, even over some bosses' objections, by Justin Lahart. Work from home is hardly over. In fact, it's probably here to stay. The past couple of years has seen a drumbeat of big companies announcing, to great fanfare, that they were requiring employees to spend more time in the office. Home Depot, Target, Microsoft, 3M, Intel, the list goes on and on. I come in, and where is everybody else? Complained J.P. Morgan Chief Executive Jamie Dimon in a recording that leaked to Barron's in early 2025. The bank required its employees to come back to the office 5 days a week starting in March last year. But across the broader economy, the evidence suggests that the return to the office has stalled out. An average of 26% of paid full days were worked from home in May, according to a monthly work from home survey run by economists Jose Maria Barrero, Nicholas Bloom, and Stephen Davis. That is down, but not by much, from the 27% registered 2 years earlier. Instead, remote work rates appear to have reached a new equilibrium, with far more people working from home at least part of the time than before the pandemic. An African nation's soccer hero, the fan who can stop goals. Congolese man's motionless presence is seen as critical to the team's success. By Nicholas Barrio, Kampala, Uganda. Misha Kakao Mumba Ladinga is on a mission so critical that the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo personally intervened so he could carry it out on his behalf. The task: stop the country's World Cup opponents from scoring. Mumba Ladinga is the Congolese national team's most famous fan, known for his practice of holding a statue-like pose and steely gaze throughout the entire games. The ritual is a tribute to his country's founding Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated in a Belgium-led plot in 1961. Lumumba via Mumba Ladinga's nickname means Lumumba lives. Known for his snappy suits and his resemblance to the slain leader, Mumba Ladinga stays frozen to give his side the strength to block shots and to win battles on the pitch. I stand motionless because I believe it gives the team emotional stamina, he says in a phone interview last week. Just as Lumumba sacrificed his life for our country, mine is a small price to pay because of how deeply I care about this team. With the deadly Ebola outbreak raging in eastern Congo, the Trump administration has erected additional barriers to entry. The Congolese players, coaches, and other staff had to isolate themselves in Belgium before traveling to Houston for their opening match against Portugal on Wednesday. Anyone else wouldn't be allowed entry into the U.S. Unfortunately for the team, they'll have to face Portugal without their super fans' help. Mumbalinga joined the team in Belgium too late to clear the Ebola health protocols in time to make it to Houston. He expects to be in Atlanta for next week's match against Uzbekistan. Leaving the front page for other news within the paper. Russia strikes cultural landmarks. Russian strikes damaged the Dormition Cathedral in Kyiv. It dates to the 11th century and has been damaged in several wars. 1,000-year-old cathedral damaged in attacks on Ukraine that kill at least 11. By James Marson. Russian airstrikes on Ukraine sparked a blaze that tore through the roof of the main cathedral at the Kyiv Monastery of the Caves, one of the holiest sites in Eastern Orthodoxy, amid an assault Sunday and Monday that led to devastating damage to Ukrainian cultural sites. Ukrainian political and church leaders decried the Russian missile and drone attacks that killed at least 11. Cultural locations across the country were damaged, including an art museum in the eastern city of Kharkiv and film studios in Kyiv that house a collection of 100,000 costumes. President Volodymyr Zelensky called the damage at the monastery an attack on the Christian community and on the cultural heritage of humanity. It is important that the world does not remain silent in response to this latest act of Russian barbarism, he said on social media. The night sky glowed orange and smoke billowed from the Dormition Cathedral in the Monastery of Caves, also known as the Pershkash Lava Monastery Complex. It dates to the 11th century and has been severely damaged in several wars since, including World War II. The Russian Defense Ministry said, without offering evidence, that the monastery had been hit by an American Patriot missile in the course of an overnight Russian barrage of missiles and drones meant to target Ukrainian drone industry installations in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Dnipro. Ukraine security services published photographs that it said was debris from a Russian explosive drone. GM in talks to make parts for Lockheed, by Sharon Turlip and Drew Fitzgerald. General Motors is in talks with Lockheed Martin about making parts for the defense contractor's weapons, people familiar with the matter said. Under the arrangement, GM would manufacture commonly used parts that could help Lockheed bolster munitions production, the people said. The companies are discussing which components GM could potentially make. An agreement hasn't been finalized, and the contours of the arrangement could change, the people said. An agreement hasn't been finalized, and the contours of the arrangement could change, the people said. Stocks of missiles and other critical weaponry have dropped because of the wars in Ukraine and Iran. To replenish supplies, Trump administration and Pentagon officials have pressed weapons makers to accelerate production while seeking to enlist other manufacturers, including GM. Israel is left scrambling for answers as pact to end war nears completion, by Dov Lieber, Tel Aviv. President Trump's deal to wind down the war with Iran set off alarm bells in Israel, where top officials are wrestling with the consequences of easing the pressure on Tehran and the risks of opening a rift with the U.S. over the war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. The tension has been heightened by the lack of certainty about what exactly Trump has agreed to in the deal, which is expected to be signed this week. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was trying to set up a meeting with the president to sort out the competing issues, a person familiar with the matter said. An Israeli strike over the weekend on Beirut in response to Hezbollah's attacks on Israel almost derailed the agreement and set off a last-minute scramble by the White House and mediators to keep the deal on track. Trump criticized the strike in an interview with the Wall Street Journal and said on social media Israel had to stop its attacks across Lebanon. That was at odds with a U.S. brokered ceasefire agreement earlier that required Israel to end the fighting only if Hezbollah also stopped. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that the U.S. was on the hook to end Israel's attacks and aggression in Lebanon, state media reported. Defying those claims, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said the military would hold its so-called security zone in Lebanon indefinitely, saying it was needed to protect communities in northern Israel. He also said Israel would act independently to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons if necessary. At a news conference Monday, Netanyahu declined to criticize the emerging deal and said his country's war aims in Iran had largely been achieved. He said Iran's war production capacity had been damaged, its economy was in tatters, and its nuclear program set back. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Trump stages an Iran retreat. The regime gets relief to reopen Hormuz and hold more nuclear talks. President Trump is touting his latest ceasefire deal with Iran as peace in our time, but the world is more likely to see it as a strategic retreat short of achieving his war aims. To reopen the Strait of Hormuz, Mr. Trump is accepting Iran's promises merely to negotiate over its nuclear program. Most of the press has been hostile from the start, but we've supported the president's Iran policy. We've done so because a nuclear Iran would be an existential threat and because we want presidents to succeed when they go to war. Mr. Trump's willingness to use military force when no one else would has set back Iran's nuclear program, military, and industrial base. The result isn't Obama Deal 2.0 because, unlike in 2015, Iran's key nuclear facilities are in rubble, and its enrichment of uranium has been halted for the first time in 20 years. The media critics and Democrats who now salvage the president would have stood by while a nuclear bomb became a fait accompli, as in North Korea. But there's no denying that Mr. Trump is retreating from his main goals as political pressure has built at home and finishing the job requires greater military risk. Despite Israel's urging, he never authorized a mission to seize Iran's enriched uranium. He never tried to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by force. Those who say Mr. Trump had no alternative to this retreat ignore that the U.S. blockade was squeezing Iran more by the day, while Iran's blockade was leaking. Mr. Trump simply didn't want to endure higher oil prices for longer. This is his choice, not a strategic imperative. The New Deal extends the ceasefire for another 60 days, though our guess is that it will be renewed perhaps many times. The U.S. blockade will end as Iran demines the strait on a timetable so traffic can be unrestricted. This seems to be Mr. Trump's main goal, which will mean lower gasoline prices before the midterm elections. But Tehran says Hormuz won't return to the status quo ante, and it claims it will charge fees, not tolls, as if that's more than a semantic difference. The full Memorandum of Understanding text hasn't been released, and Mr. Trump says some of it is a little conceptual, which is the problem. It would defer most matters of the nuclear program to 60 more days of talks, with oil and other sanctions relief along the way in exchange for diplomatic progress. This linkage is crucial, but pushing off the most difficult nuclear issues in talks with dishonorable people who don't deal in good faith, as the president called them on Friday, doesn't inspire confidence. If the regime won't agree to dismantle its nuclear program now, why would it do so after weeks of oil exports and other relief? A strong nuclear deal isn't hard to define. Zero uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. No stockpile of enriched uranium. All relevant nuclear facilities, centrifuges, and manufacturing sites dismantled. Complete disclosure and unrestricted inspections. Iran's attestation that it doesn't seek the bomb is meaningless. It has always said that and done the opposite. A good deal has to remove capabilities. A promise now to find a solution for the enriched uranium over 60 days means little, unless it specifically commits Iran to removing, diluting, or destroying the entire stockpile on a reasonable timetable. Merely disposing of the highly enriched uranium doesn't work when enrichment, even to the low-seeming 3.67%, is already 70% of the way to weapons grade. Meanwhile, allowing oil exports will rescue the regime financially, and resuming sanctions enforcement won't be easy when Iran can threaten the deal and the strait in reply. Granting the regime access to billions of dollars in frozen funds before nuclear negotiations would be another bailout. Mr. Trump's talk of investing in Iran suggests he's making the Barack Obama mistake of thinking the revolutionary regime wants Iran to be a normal country. There's no evidence it does. The deal also includes no Iranian commitments on its missiles and terror proxies. These will be put off to regional discussions from which no one expects much. This poses risks to Israel from Hezbollah, which the deal could protect in Lebanon, as well as to the Gulf Arab states that bore the brunt of Iran's attacks. An irony of this deal is that the Gulf states will need greater U.S. defense commitments if Iran is allowed to rebuild its missile arsenal, or they will make their own accommodations to Iran. The biggest risk is if Mr. Trump sees this deal as a de facto partnership with Iran's regime. Like Mr. Obama, he might overlook violations to strike the final deal or preserve it once it is signed. The people of Iran, who Mr. Trump promised to help, would be the big losers. Iran's new leaders are likely to conclude that Mr. Trump has no desire for more conflict, and they will negotiate accordingly. Congress should scrutinize any final agreement Mr. Trump makes with Iran and reject it if it props up a regime that still says death to America. From the opinion pages. With an Iran deal, Trump returns to realism. Regime change would have been desirable, but the U.S. was unwilling to bear the cost of escalation. By Gerard Baker. Not for the first time, we may be on the brink of a deal to end the war with Iran. If this one holds, President Trump is to be congratulated, not pilloried. He faces a choice between high-risk escalation with an uncertain outcome and cutting our losses with an imperfect deal. But there could be a bigger strategic reason to be grateful. Handled right, this moment presents an opportunity to return to the deployment of an assertive realism in U.S. foreign policy over the idealistic siren call that again lured an American president onto the treacherous rocks of geopolitics remaking, regime-changing interventionism. The argument against this war was never that it was unjustified. The Iranian regime has American blood on its hands. We would be safer and the world a better place if it were gone or at least disarmed. The case against it concerned whether this war was prudent, whether we could achieve our aims with the resources we were prepared to commit. After a month of bombing that damaged but didn't destroy Iran's missile capabilities, that failed to eliminate its nuclear materials, and that handed the regime control of one of the world's most important shipping lanes, it became clear we couldn't achieve those goals at an acceptable price. The depletion of munitions, economic damage, and escalating harm to American prestige and strategic interest made the effort, and still more so, further escalation, not worth it. So after another unhappy flirtation with the failed idea that America can remake the world with just the right amount of will, there's a good chance Mr. Trump will revert to the foreign policy doctrine that served him well before February 28th. The search for a definitive typology of Trumpian foreign policy has been going on since he came to office. To me, it's clear Mr. Trump operates on what we might call a Hobbesian principle. The 17th century English writer Thomas Hobbes painted a hypothetical picture of human relations rooted in a state of nature, one without laws, norms, or social institutions, in which the position men occupied and the power they wielded were determined, as in nature, simply by strength or weakness. As a theory of political power relations, the idea was famously illustrated centuries earlier by the Greek historian Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War, when the Athenians brought the rebellious island of Melos to heel and parleyed on what to do with its inhabitants. The nasty, brutish view prevailed, and its cynical operating principle was applied. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The uber-realist approach to international relations has been rejected by foreign policy experts for both practical and moral reasons. But you can make the case that Mr. Trump had a clearer understanding of modern geopolitics than the experts and nudged America in its direction in recent years. For decades, American power was constrained by its willing participation in a system of international rules, alliances, and institutions. This worked for us because it helped create a global system we led. But in recent years, the case for the rules-based system has eroded. It was failing before Mr. Trump came to Washington, exploited by allies and enemies alike. European and Asian allies had ridden on American alliance. China had taken advantage of the rules to advance its own interest. Russia blew through it completely with repeated invasions of its neighbors. The case for an approach tilted more toward the raw pursuit of American interest on the basis of raw American power is compelling. But that power needs to be exercised judiciously. That is more or less what Mr. Trump did before the folly of epic fury. In his first term, with targeted military operations against Qasem Soleimani and ISIS terrorists, and economic confrontation with China. In his second, with the destruction of Iranian nuclear facilities last year and the capture of Nicolas Maduro in January. Realism must embrace reality. The president has discovered that in both the economic and the military fields, there are limits to what the U.S. can achieve with its power. Last year, he backed off an all-out economic war with China when Beijing demonstrated it had economic power of its own. Iran has now demonstrated there are limits to what we can achieve militarily at a reasonable cost. Geopolitical realism, selective and opportunistic military endeavors, and the targeted use of economic power can still work to advance our interest. But this realism may also require us to do things Mr. Trump hasn't been so good at, such as working with allies, even feckless ones, or listening to the advice of a friend like Volodymyr Zelensky, with whom we might have inflicted greater damage on a strategic rival, rather than one like Benjamin Netanyahu in a project that ended up doing us more harm than good. The Hobbesian approach isn't very idealistic. It doesn't appeal to the American instinct for moral as well as material superiority. But the naked pursuit of our national interest is a surer route to the survival of our values than the fruitless chasing of unrealistic aspirations. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Girl Dads Take on Maine. Meet the men behind a ballot initiative to protect female spaces from boys and men, by William McGurn. Maine takes pride in its progressive credentials. Even so, its Democratic primary voters chose Graham Plattner as their nominee for the U.S. Senate. The same Mr. Plattner, who the New York Times reports has made dismissive remarks online about rape, who CNN reports faces allegations of unsettling behavior toward women he dated, and who Representative Ro Khanna, a supporter, concedes is guilty of misogynistic acts. Still, Maine Democrats awarded Mr. Plattner 72% of the Democratic primary vote. Now comes something even more interesting from Maine, a movement rooted in biological reality to reclaim women's sports and their spaces, notably locker rooms for girls. It is led by what the dominant orthodoxy regards as perhaps the most toxic life form in America today, dads. And not just any dads. These are girl dads, and they are led by a man named Leyland Strafe. He says his group has 8,000 men like him, men who are grateful for the sports opportunities their daughters have that their mothers and grandmothers didn't. They intend to keep it that way. Their immediate focus is to get their Protect Girls Sports in Maine initiative on the November ballot. They want their daughters to take their rightful places on fields and courts and have their locker rooms and bathrooms assigned by biological reality, sex, and not ideological fashion, gender identity. Strafe is the father of 2 sons and 1 daughter. He says the incident that galvanized him into action happened when his daughter, Sienna, was starting 2nd grade. She said her teacher had read the class a book that had images of men with beards wearing dresses and told the class that gender is simply a feeling. You might be a boy, a girl, both, or neither, the teacher said. His daughter responded, "But that doesn't make any sense. I don't feel like a girl. I just am a girl." The Marine Girl Dads started organizing. Opponents of the ballot measure argued it violates the Maine Human Rights Act because the act forbids discrimination on the basis of gender identity. That's exactly the point, said the girl dads. Their referendum would make sex the defining standard and bring Maine law in line with common sense and the federal government's understanding of Title IX, which also makes sex and not gender identity the rule. Simply put, Mr. Strafe says, what he and his fellow girl dads want is no more males in female spaces or sports. The dads say they aren't trying to exclude. Transgender students are free to compete as athletes based on their sex. The movement has hit some snags. The Marine Girl Dads collected more than 70,000 signatures for their petition. Submitted in February, it was validated in March. Then came a lawsuit, which led to a public hearing. Approval was then reversed after a review by Maine's Secretary of State found that more than 12,500 signatures invalid for reasons ranging from duplicate signatures to signatories not matching local registration rolls. This left them about 500 votes short. Last week, a Maine Superior Court judge upheld the decision to keep the initiative off November's ballot. The Maine girl dads are confident that they and their daughters will ultimately prevail. If their question isn't on the ballot this fall, says Mr. Strafe, it will be on the next statewide ballot in November 2027 or 2028. Polls suggest this is a losing issue for opponents. In March 2025, the University of New Hampshire's Pine Tree State poll showed 64% of Mainers agree that men shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's sports. Most recently, the Pan American Research Omnibus poll asked a version of the question the Maine Secretary of State had drafted for the ballot. Do you want to change civil rights and education laws to require public schools to restrict access to bathrooms and sports based on the gender of the child's original birth certificate and allow students to sue the schools? 44% answered yes, against 34% who said no, and 22% not sure. Mr. Plattner has denounced the ballot initiative as an invented culture war scare, but the Maine girl dads are confident they have the people on their side. Every poll shows us winning this referendum by a significant margin with overwhelming bipartisan support, Mr. Strafe says. Every daughter is relieved as there's no longer fighting this issue alone or feeling forced into silence. And every day, more dads across Maine are finding their voices. In other words, we've simply done what dads do for their daughters every day, show them the way out, even when they thought all hope was lost. Letter to the editor when food stamp fraud crosses state lines. The journal's editorial board is right to celebrate the decline in food stamp enrollment due to work requirements and efforts to combat fraud. To put a finer point on the fraud that the Trump administration is trying to root out, consider what my organization recently discovered in Michigan. We found that since 2024, Michigan has paid more than $4 million in food stamp funding to people with out-of-state addresses. That's despite a law requiring that program recipients live in state. The problem has grown worse each year. Out-of-state payments rose from $1.6 million in 2024 to $1.9 million in 2025. The number of out-of-state recipients is on track to rise from nearly 3,200 last year to 3,700 this year. Under Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan has refused to share food stamp data with the Trump administration. When will states like Michigan finally get serious about protecting taxpayers from waste, fraud, and abuse? From Jarrett Skorup, Mackinac Center, Midland, Michigan. The Pepper and Salt cartoon shows two moose facing each other, one with a baseball cap on his head. The caption, "And I intend to keep wearing it until my antlers grow back." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the June 16th,